The man who walked out of the Bitterroot Mountains on October 17, 1903, was not the same man who had entered them 41 days earlier. His name was Arthur Covington Webb. He was 23 years old. He weighed, by the physician's estimate in Missoula, no more than 108 pounds. His boots were gone. His feet were wrapped in what appeared to be canvas torn from a tent. His hands were scarred in ways the doctor would later describe in his private notes as inconsistent with typical exposure or accidental injury. Webb spoke only once upon his arrival at the ranger station near Lolo Pass. "They're not coming back," he said. Then he closed his mouth, and for the remainder of his life, 53 years to be precise, he did not open it again on the subject of what had happened in those mountains. The others were never found. There were 4 of them. Samuel Fairchild, age 31, expedition leader and Webb's cousin by marriage. Ernest Lowe, 28, a surveyor from Butte with alpine experience. Martin Kehoe, 26, a photographer contracted by the Northern Pacific Railroad to document potential tourism routes. And James Pettigrew, 34, a geologist employed by the same railroad. All 4 men were educated. All 4 were physically robust. All 4 had provisions, maps, and reputations that suggested competence. Arthur Webb had none of these things. He had been invited, according to his sister's later testimony, only because Fairchild's wife had insisted. "Arthur hasn't had a proper opportunity," she'd said. "He's been sickly his whole life. Fresh air might do him good." Webb had worked, prior to the expedition, as a bookkeeper in a dry goods store in Spokane. He had poor eyesight. He suffered from what his physician called nervous digestion. He had never camped farther than 10 miles from a railroad depot. He was, by every measure available to us, the weakest man in the group. He was also the only one who survived. When Webb returned, the authorities were waiting. A deputy U.S. Marshal named Clayton Rourke had been dispatched from Missoula the moment word came through that someone had emerged from the search zone. Rourke was an experienced investigator. He had dealt with mining disasters, claim disputes, and at least 2 cases of suspected murder in the backcountry. He spent 3 hours with Arthur Webb on the evening of October 17th. His report, filed 2 days later, contains only the following summary. Subject states that the party became separated on or about September 22nd in the vicinity of the upper Selway drainage. Subject continued alone. Subject found no trace of companions thereafter. Subject offers no explanation for the separation. Subject declines to provide further detail. Subject appears physically exhausted but mentally coherent. No evidence of intoxication or mania. Rourke tried again the following week. Webb's physician, Dr. Homer Talbot, was present for the second interview. His notes indicate that Webb sat in a chair by the window of his sister's home in Missoula, hands folded in his lap, and that he did not look at Rourke during the entirety of the conversation. Rourke asked Webb if the men had quarreled. Webb said no. Rourke asked if there had been an accident. Webb said he did not know. Rourke asked if Webb had seen any of the men after September 22nd. Webb did not answer. Rourke asked if Webb understood that the families were grieving, that they deserved to know what had happened, that withholding information could be construed as obstruction. Webb turned his head toward the window and said, very quietly, "I can't help them." "Doctor?" Talbot noted that Webb's pulse was elevated and that his hands had begun to tremble. The interview was terminated at Talbot's insistence. There would be no third interview. The marshal's office, under pressure from the families, organized a search party in late October. 18 men, including 2 Nez Perce guides, spent 11 days combing the upper Selway and the adjacent drainages. They found a campsite that appeared to have been abandoned in haste. They found a leather satchel containing surveying instruments, later identified as belonging to Ernest Lowe. They found no bodies. They found no graves. They found no further evidence of the missing men. The search was called off on November 9th due to early snow. Arthur Webb did not participate. He did not offer to guide the searchers. He did not mark a map. When asked by Fairchild's widow if there was any place, any landmark, anything at all he could remember that might help, he told her, "I'm sorry, I can't." She slapped him. The incident was witnessed by Webb's sister, and by a Presbyterian minister named Holloway, who had come to offer pastoral comfort. Neither intervened. According to Holloway's later account, Webb accepted the blow without flinching, without protest, and without tears. He looked, Holloway wrote, like a man who believed he deserved it. In the years that followed, theories accumulated like sediment. Some believed the men had been killed by a grizzly. Others suspected a fall, a rockslide, a sudden storm. There were darker rumors that Webb had murdered them for their supplies, that he had gone mad and attacked them, that he had led them into a trap of some kind. None of these theories were ever substantiated. What we know is this. Arthur Webb returned to Spokane in the spring of 1904. He resumed his position at the dry goods store. He lived alone in a boarding house on West Riverside. He attended church irregularly. He never married. He had no close friends that any record preserves. In 1911, a journalist from the Spokane Daily Chronicle located him and requested an interview for a feature on unsolved mysteries of the Pacific Northwest. Webb declined. In 1927, a true crime writer from Chicago tracked him down, offering payment for his story. Webb declined. In 1949, a graduate student in history at the University of Washington wrote to him, explaining that she was compiling an oral history of early exploration in the Bitterroots and that his testimony would be invaluable. Webb did not reply. He died in 1956 of heart failure in a veterans' hospital in Walla Walla. He had no surviving family. His effects were minimal: clothing, a few books, a pocket watch, a small amount of cash. There was no journal. There were no letters. There was no confession. His silence was absolute. And it is that silence, not what happened, but what he refused to say about what happened, that has occupied me now for the better part of 3 years. To understand the silence, we must first reconstruct the sound. The expedition was planned over the course of 4 months in the spring and summer of 1903. Samuel Fairchild, the organizer, was a civil engineer with the Northern Pacific. He had a reputation for thoroughness. His letters to the other members of the party, preserved in the railroad's archive, are precise, methodical, and optimistic. "We will follow the Loxa River to its headwaters," he wrote to Ernest Lowe in May, "then cross into the Selway drainage via the saddle east of Granite Peak." The railroad is considering a spur route for tourism, fishing lodges, hunting cabins, that sort of thing. Our task is to assess feasibility and document the landscape. Martin will handle the photography. You'll do the survey work. Pettigrew will examine the geology. Arthur will keep the log and manage supplies. It was, on paper, a reasonable division of labor. What is striking, in hindsight, is Fairchild's tone when writing about Webb. "Arthur is not robust," Fairchild admitted to Lowe, "but he is diligent and literate, and my wife insists he needs the experience. I trust you will look after him as needed." There is no evidence that Lowe objected. In fact, the surviving correspondence suggests that all 4 men viewed Webb's inclusion with a kind of benign condescension. He was the expedition's charity case, the sickly cousin who needed fresh air and purpose. He would carry the lighter packs, manage the inventory, keep the written record. He would not be expected to do the hard work. This was not cruelty. It was, by the standards of the time, kindness. But it is important to note, Arthur Webb was not regarded as an equal. The party departed Missoula by train on September 5, 1903, and reached the trailhead near Lolo Hot Springs the following day. From there, they proceeded on foot, accompanied by 2 pack mules purchased from a local rancher. We have, in the archives of the Montana Historical Society, a single photograph taken on the morning of September 6th. It shows the 5 men standing in front of a white canvas tent. Fairchild is in the center, hands on his hips, smiling. Lowe and Pettigrew flank him, both holding rifles. Kehoe, the photographer, stands slightly apart, his camera on a tripod beside him. And at the far right, partially in shadow, is Arthur Webb. He is not smiling. He is looking directly at the camera, but his expression is difficult to pass. He does not appear frightened exactly, nor does he appear confident. There is something in his face, something the grain of the photograph does not quite resolve, that suggests watchfulness. Or perhaps that is only what I want to see. We know they made good progress in the first week. Fairchild's log, recovered from the abandoned campsite, records daily mileage, weather conditions, and brief observations. His handwriting is neat, his tone is satisfied. Day 4, reached confluence of Loxa and Warm Springs Creek. Terrain more challenging than anticipated but manageable. Arthur keeping pace adequately. Morale excellent. Day 7, crossed into Alpine Zone. Visibility superb. Martin photographed elk herd at dusk. Ernest confirms survey markers align with railroad maps. No sign of previous human passage. We are alone in this country. On September 12th, Fairchild noted Arthur unwell this morning. Stomach trouble. Rested until midday. He insists he can continue. I believe him. This is the last entry in the log. What we know of the interpersonal dynamics comes largely from two sources. A letter Ernest Lowe sent to his fiancée in Butte on September 10th, mailed from Lolo before the party left the trailhead, and a brief memoir written decades later by Martin Kehoe's widow, who had heard stories from her husband before his disappearance. Lowe's letter is cheerful, almost jaunty. Fairchild is a natural leader, he wrote. Pettigrew is a fine companion, educated, well-read, good for conversation around the fire. Kehoe is obsessed with his camera but pleasant enough. And then there is Arthur. Poor Arthur, who tries very hard and is very kind, but is simply not built for this sort of thing. We take turns carrying part of his load when he lags behind. He does not complain. I think he is embarrassed, but he need not be. We all do what we can. There is no malice in this, only pity. Kehoe's widow, in her memoir, recalled a story her husband had told her upon returning from a previous expedition with Fairchild. She wrote, Martin said that Samuel Fairchild had a way of making every man feel necessary. He would ask your opinion even if he had already decided. He would thank you for small things. He was the sort of man you wanted to impress. Martin admired him greatly. She did not mention Arthur Webb, but in a later passage, she wrote something that has stayed with me. Martin told me once that the hardest part of those trips was not the terrain or the weather. It was the silence, not the quiet of the wilderness, that he loved, but the silence between men who have nothing in common except proximity. He said you learn a great deal about a person when there is nothing to do but walk and talk and sit by a fire. You learn who listens, who interrupts, who tells the truth and who performs. He said some men cannot bear to be known. She did not say which men, but I wonder. We know that by mid-September, the party had moved deep into the Selway drainage, far beyond the range of any settlement or established trail. They were in true wilderness, the kind of country where a man can walk for weeks and see no trace of another human being. This was deliberate. Fairchild wanted unspoiled landscapes. The railroad wanted photographs of pristine peaks, untouched forests, the promise of adventure. But isolation has consequences. In such places, there is no recourse, no law, no witness. A man is accountable only to the men beside him. And if something goes wrong, if trust is broken, if fear or anger or desperation takes hold, there is no one to stop what happens next. I do not know what happened, but I know this. Arthur Webb returned, and the others did not. Block 3. The separation. The last confirmed sighting of all 5 men together comes from the recovered camp. It was located by the search party in late October, approximately 19 miles southeast of the expedition's planned route, in a narrow canyon carved by a tributary of the Selway River. The site was partially sheltered by a rock overhang. There were remnants of a fire. There were scattered supplies, tin plates, a coffee pot, a coil of rope, the surveying instruments I mentioned earlier, and there was blood. Not much, but enough. The searchers documented it carefully. It was on a flat stone near the fire pit. The stone showed evidence of impact, chipped edges, a shallow depression. Dr. Elias Croft, the physician who accompanied the search party, examined the site and concluded in his report that the blood was human, that it had likely come from a scalp wound, and that the volume was consistent with a non-fatal injury. Though blood loss may have been greater than what remains visible, there was no body. There was no sign of a struggle. The blood had dried in place, undisturbed. The search party also found something else. In the dirt near the overhang, someone had scratched a message. It was rough, shallow, barely legible. The letters were irregular, as though carved in haste or in poor light. It read, "Gone ahead. So." The initial almost certainly stood for Samuel Fairchild. But where had they gone, and why? The searchers followed every drainage, every ridge, every possible route. They found nothing, no tracks, no cairns, no further camps. It was as though the four men had simply dissolved into the landscape. Arthur Webb, when shown a sketch of the message weeks later, stared at it for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know what it means." The investigator pressed him. "You don't know? Or you won't say?" Webb folded his hands in his lap. "I don't know. Let us consider what we do know. We know the separation occurred, by Webb's own admission, on or around September 22nd. We know the party had been in the mountains for 16 days at that point. We know they were far from any trail, in difficult terrain, with diminishing supplies. We know that something happened at that camp. The blood tells us that much. We know that Fairchild, or someone using his initial, left a message indicating forward movement. And we know that Arthur Webb did not go with them. Why? This is the question that consumed the families, the investigators, the journalists, and eventually, me. There are only a few possibilities. 1. Webb was injured or too weak to continue, and the others left him behind, intending to return. 2. Webb was deliberately abandoned. 3. Webb left of his own accord. 4. Webb was the cause of the separation. Each scenario raises further questions. If the others intended to return for him, why didn't they? If he was abandoned, how did he survive when he was the weakest among them? If he left voluntarily, why? And if he caused the separation through conflict, through accident, through something worse, why would he return at all? Webb never answered any of these questions, but there is one document, discovered only recently in the archives of the Presbyterian Church in Missoula, that may offer a clue. In November of 1903, Reverend Holloway, the same minister who witnessed the encounter between Webb and Fairchild's widow, wrote a letter to a colleague in Portland. The letter was not about the expedition. It was a theological reflection on the nature of guilt and confession. But in it, Holloway included the following passage: "I have been counseling a young man recently returned from a great tragedy. He will not speak of what occurred, and I do not press him, for I sense that his silence is not mere stubbornness but something deeper, perhaps a form of protection, or penance, or both. He came to me once and asked if a man could be forgiven for a sin he could not name. I told him that God's mercy is infinite, but that confession is the pathway to grace. He thanked me and did not return." Holloway does not name Arthur Webb in the letter, but the timing is unmistakable. What sin could not be named? What had Webb done or failed to do that he could not bring himself to confess? I have spent countless hours turning this question over. I have read every document, every testimony, every scrap of evidence. I have walked the site myself, or as near to it as modern access allows. I have stood where Webb stood, or where I imagine he stood, and tried to see what he saw. And I have come to believe that the silence itself is the answer. Not because Webb had nothing to say, but because what he had to say was unendurable. Consider the campsite again. The blood, the message, the abandoned supplies. Consider the timeline. 16 days into the mountains, supplies running low, tensions perhaps beginning to fray. 5 men, isolated, dependent on one another. And then something happens. An argument, an accident, a decision made in haste or in fear. Someone is hurt. Fairchild, perhaps, or one of the others. And the group must decide, do we stay or do we go? Do we all stay together or do we split up? Do we take the injured man with us or do we leave him? And what if the injured man is not the only problem? What if there is someone else, someone weaker, someone slower, who is also holding them back? I'm speculating now, I acknowledge that, but consider this. Arthur Webb was the weakest man in the group. He had been ill on September 12th. He had been struggling to keep pace. The others had been carrying his load. If the situation became desperate, if speed became survival, would they have taken him? Or would they have left him? And if they left him, what would he have felt? Relief? Guilt? Rage? There is one more detail from the recovered campsite that I have not yet mentioned. The searchers found, tucked beneath a stone near the fire pit, a small leather-bound notebook. It was water-damaged and partially illegible, but enough remained to identify it as belonging to Arthur Webb. It contained supply inventories, lists of equipment, mileage estimates, and on the final page, in Webb's handwriting, a single sentence: "I should not have come. That is all. No date, no context, no explanation, just those 5 words. Arthur Webb returned to Spokane in the spring of 1904. He did not return to his sister's house in Missoula. He did not attend any of the memorial services held for the missing men. He did not respond to letters from the families. He simply went back to Spokane, resumed his old job, and disappeared into the ordinary rhythms of a small, quiet life. But he was not left alone. Not at first. The first person to confront him was Ernest Lowe's fiancée, a school teacher named Catherine Driscoll. She traveled to Spokane in June of 1904 and waited for Webb outside the dry goods store where he worked. When he emerged at the end of the day, she stepped in front of him. "Mr. Webb," she said, "I need to know what happened to Ernest." Webb stopped. He looked at her. Then he looked down. "I'm sorry," he said. "I can't help you. Can't or won't." He did not answer. Catherine Driscoll stood there for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "You were there. You saw. And you will not tell me. That makes you complicit." Webb flinched, but he did not argue. "I hope you never sleep again," she said. Then she walked away. According to the boarding house ledger, Webb requested a new room that same week, one on a higher floor, farther from the street. In August of 1904, James Pettigrew's brother, a lawyer from Helena, came to Spokane with the intention of forcing Webb to testify in a civil proceeding. The brother, William Pettigrew, believed that Webb could be compelled to speak under oath. He was wrong. The proceeding was held in a Spokane courtroom on August 19th. Webb was called to the stand. He swore to tell the truth. And then, when asked to describe what had happened in the mountains, he said, "I cannot." The judge asked him to clarify. Did he mean he could not remember, or that he would not answer? Webb said, "I cannot." The judge warned him that refusal to testify could result in contempt charges. Webb said, "I understand." The judge asked him again. Webb said nothing. The judge held him in contempt and ordered him jailed for 10 days. Webb served the sentence without protest. When he was released, he returned to his job and his boarding house and did not speak of the matter again. William Pettigrew abandoned the civil case shortly thereafter. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "There is something in that man that cannot be reached by law or reason. I do not know if it is guilt or grief or cowardice, but I am convinced we will never know the truth." The families continued to press for answers, but their efforts yielded nothing. In 1906, Fairchild's widow hired a private investigator, a former Pinkerton agent named Donald Straw. Straw spent 3 months in Spokane following Webb, interviewing his co-workers, searching for any crack in the silence. He found none. In his final report, Straw wrote, "Subject maintains no close relationships. Subject drinks minimally and never to excess. Subject attends church irregularly, but does not socialize with congregants. Subject's co-workers describe him as polite, competent, and entirely unremarkable. Subject shows no signs of wealth or unexplained resources. Subject does not appear to be concealing a crime so much as withdrawing from life itself." Straw concluded that Webb was either innocent or so deeply disturbed by what had occurred that he had dissociated entirely from the events in question. "If he is guilty," Straw wrote, "he is punishing himself more thoroughly than any court could." There were rumors, of course. Some claimed Webb had been seen speaking to a priest in Coeur d'Alene, confessing to murder. Others said he had tried to take his own life in 1910, only to be stopped by a neighbor. Still others insisted he had been overheard muttering in his sleep at the boarding house, saying things like, "I couldn't stop it," and they wouldn't listen. None of these rumors were ever confirmed. What is confirmed is this: Arthur Webb lived alone, worked quietly, and spoke to almost no one for 52 years. He was not a recluse in the strict sense. He went to work. He bought groceries. He walked the streets of Spokane like any other man, but he was alone in a way that went beyond solitude. There is a photograph of him from 1932, taken by a street photographer in downtown Spokane. Webb would have been 52 years old at the time. He is walking past a storefront, hands in his coat pockets, hat pulled low. The photographer likely did not know who he was. It was simply a candid shot, one of dozens taken that day. But when I look at that photograph, I see something. Webb is not looking at the camera. He is looking down at the sidewalk as though he is counting steps or studying the ground for something lost. His face is gaunt. His shoulders are narrow. He looks exactly like what he was, a man carrying something too heavy to set down. In 1949, the graduate student I mentioned earlier, her name was Eleanor Voss, wrote to Webb asking for an interview. She received no reply. Undeterred, she traveled to Spokane and located him at his boarding house. She knocked on his door. He answered. She introduced herself. She explained her project. She told him that she was not interested in assigning blame, only in preserving history, and that his testimony would be invaluable. Webb listened. Then he said, "I have nothing to say." "Nothing at all?" she asked. He shook his head. "May I ask why?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Because some things should not be said." And he closed the door. Eleanor Voss returned to Seattle and completed her thesis without Webb's testimony, but she never forgot that encounter. In a footnote to her published work, she wrote, "Arthur Webb's refusal to speak was not, I believe, the refusal of a guilty man seeking to avoid punishment. It was the refusal of a man who understood that certain truths, once spoken, cannot be unspoken, and that silence, however painful, may be the only ethical response to an event that defies explanation or absolution." I think she was right. Arthur Webb died on April 3, 1956, in a veterans hospital in Walla Walla, Washington. He had been admitted 2 weeks earlier with congestive heart failure. The attending physician, Dr. Raymond Cutler, noted that Webb had been living in a rented room above a hardware store and that he had no known family, no visitors, and no personal effects beyond a small suitcase containing clothing and a single book, a copy of Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. Webb was conscious for most of his final days. He was polite to the nurses. He ate when food was brought. He did not complain. On the evening of April 2nd, Dr. Cutler sat with him for a while. It was not unusual for Cutler to do this with terminal patients. He believed in the value of presence. They did not speak at first. Then Webb said very quietly, "Do you think a man can be forgiven if he never asks?" Cutler later recorded this in his notes. He also recorded his response. "I told him I didn't know," Cutler wrote. "I asked him if he wanted to talk about it. He shook his head. I asked him if there was anyone I could contact, a priest, a chaplain, anyone. He said no. Then he closed his eyes and said, 'It's too late anyway.' Those were the last words he spoke. He died the following morning. I have been studying Arthur Webb for 3 years now. I have read every document. I have interviewed descendants of the missing men. I have consulted with experts in wilderness survival, in historical psychology, in the ethics of testimony and silence. And I have come to a conclusion, not about what happened, but about why Webb never spoke. I believe Arthur Webb survived because the others made a decision. I believe that decision involved him. I believe he understood why they made it. And I believe he could not forgive them or himself for what followed. Consider the evidence again. Webb was the weakest. He had been ill. He had been slowing the group down. If supplies were running low, if time was running short, if the men were desperate, they may have concluded that their only chance of survival was to leave him behind. Not out of cruelty, out of necessity. Fairchild's note, "Gone ahead," may have been an apology, or a promise, or simply an explanation. We will never know. But here is what I think happened. The men left Webb at the camp. They told him they would return. They may have even believed it. But something went wrong. They encountered an obstacle, a storm, a fall, an injury worse than the one at the camp, and they did not return. Webb waited. For how long, I do not know. but at some point he understood that they were not coming back. And he had a choice. He could stay and die, or he could go and live. He chose to live, and I think that choice destroyed him. Because if my theory is correct, then Arthur Webb survived by doing the thing he had been told he could not do. He survived alone, without help, without the men who had carried his load and sheltered him and pitied him. He survived when they, stronger, more capable, more experienced, did not. And I think he knew what that would look like. It would look like he had let them die. It would look like he had abandoned them. It would look like he had saved himself at their expense, even if none of that was true, even if he had done nothing wrong. But there is another possibility, one I have considered and cannot dismiss. What if Webb's survival was not passive? What if, in that camp, in that moment of decision, something else happened? What if the men did not leave Webb behind? What if Webb left them? What if there was a confrontation, a moment when fear or anger or desperation overtook reason, and Webb, the weak one, the pitied one, did something that changed everything? What if the blood on the stone was not from an accident? What if the message, "Gone ahead," was not written by Fairchild at all? I do not believe this, but I cannot prove it is false. And that is the terrible gift of Arthur Webb's silence. It leaves room for every possibility. It leaves us to imagine the worst, and it protects him from having to defend himself against accusations that may or may not be fair. Because here is what I have learned. Silence is not always weakness. Sometimes it is the only dignity left to a man who has lived through something unendurable. Sometimes it is a refusal to let others decide the meaning of your suffering. Sometimes it is an act of mercy, not toward yourself, but toward those you loved. If Webb had spoken, the families would have demanded details. They would have asked why he did not do more, fight harder, try something else. They would have dissected his choices and judged him for surviving when their husbands and sons and brothers did not. And Webb, I think, understood that no answer he gave would ever be enough. So he gave none. I think of Eleanor Voss's question, "May I ask why?" And Webb's answer, "Because some things should not be said, not because they are too terrible, but because words cannot hold them. Because once spoken, they become something other than what they were. They become stories, interpretations, weapons." And Arthur Webb, I believe, refused to let that happen. In the end, I do not know what occurred in the Bitterroot Mountains in September of 1903. I do not know if the men abandoned Webb, or if Webb abandoned them, or if something else entirely transpired, something none of us have imagined. I do not know if Webb was innocent or guilty, or something in between. What I know is this: Arthur Webb walked out of those mountains alone. He carried that aloneness for the rest of his life. And when he died, he took his story with him, not because he owed it to anyone, but because it was his. And silence in the end was the only truth he could bear to keep.